Hey everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Awesome. And yeah, as people come in, just feel free to go in and go sit down. If you guys need to tell them to come in, I'm fine with it as well. All right, I'm going to do a complete rug pull and change the topic of the talk completely. So I put these slides together this morning because I thought the topic was much more interesting than talking about MEV-Boost again. I've given a lot of different podcasts over the course of the last month about MEV-Boost and sort of what the implications for it. So I want to try to address a topic that's like a little bit more cutting edge, topical, and sort of explore these ideas with you all. I'm going to present a few slides and then I think we can get some mics around and do a bit of Q&A and answer some questions. Yeah, these are sort of half-formed ideas. Okay, so order flow has a solution. So one of the things that MEV sort of brings to blockchain is this idea of an MEV supply chain. And while actually, let's get a show of hands on this. How many of you are familiar with the concept of the MEV supply chain? Just put your hand up. Okay, all right, a good group. Then I'll cover it quickly. So before Flashbots existed, we sort of had a mental model where users would interact with wallets. Wallets would send transaction to a transaction pool, and then the transaction pool would make its way to miners, and miners would include those transactions into a block. When Flashbots came around, then we sort of introduced this additional role, which is of a searcher, right? And so for the last couple of years or so, users send transaction to a wallet sends it to the transaction pool, it's sort of picked up by a searcher, and then submitted to a builder/validator that's integrated, which is called a miner. And now with the merge that's coming up this week, we're sort of separating out the builder and the validator role, and that's the sort of new change that MEV-Boost is bringing to Ethereum. However, one of the concerns that people have about MEV-Boost, about the introduction of this new builder role, is that it has the potential to become centralized, right? So it's a centralized, sort of specialized entity that's aggregating a bunch of different transactions, a bunch of different bundles, and trying to produce a block. And one of the vectors by which it can try to become centralized is through capturing exclusive order flow. So John Charbonneau sort of created this graphic, and he has a nice post, also a Twitter thread, you guys can go check it out, that explores the idea of why order flow can lead to centralization. So what you do is, as a block builder, you show up to MetaMask or some other wallet and you say, hey, you can give me your transaction flow. I'm going to only do backrunning to it, so I won't do any predatory MEV. And it's going to give you some money that you can then monetize your order flow, and all of a sudden you have a business model. So payment for order flow. In exchange, what I want as a block builder is I want exclusivity. So I want to be the only person that has access to these transactions. This gives me an edge, right? Because I'm competing against all the other block builders and getting the blocks including on chain. And now I have all of a sudden all these transactions that are valuable that no one else has. So I'm able to increase the total value of my block relative to the value of the block of the competition, right? So higher value build blocks. What does this allow me to do? Well, it allows me to consistently pay more for the block space. I'm bidding against all these other block builders for the block space. I'm bidding for the validators to accept my block over anyone else's block. And if I have a more valuable block, I'm able to bid more. All right, so now I'm consistently winning more of the block space. What can I then do? Well, then I can justify and say, hey, I'm winning the majority of the block space. You should continue sending more transactions to me because I'm able to give you better rates for it. And so the loop continues. So this is sort of the exclusive order flow problem that is starting to be discussed here. All right, so where do we go from here? I'm going to posit that exclusive order flow is not actually a problem. And I'm going to posit that there's sort of market dynamics and economic reasons why the problem will go away on its own. And this is all through looking at what order flow systems look like. So I'm sort of defining this new term, order flow systems, out of nowhere, so I'll provide a bit of context on what I mean by it. The transaction pool is an order flow system. It's a peer-to-peer decentralized order flow transparent system that like doesn't provide any privacy guarantees, but has good censorship resistance and spam protection guarantees. You sign a transaction that commits to pay a certain amount of gas. If it gets included on chain, it gets propagated in this peer-to-peer network, lands on the other side, and then gets included on chain. Right, okay. What is exclusive order flow? Well, that's also an order flow system. It's saying, I just give my transaction over to a builder or searcher, and it's the most centralized sort of version of an order flow system. It has a single counterparty that's able to see the transaction. But there's a whole design space of other order flow systems that you can use for routing these transactions to multiple different types of users. And so the design space here is like fairly novel and fairly researched, but is one that's likely to evolve a lot over the course of the next year. So how do we categorize and think about the design of an order flow system? And how do we think about comparing two different order flow systems with regards to each other? Which one is going to win? I'm going to provide a few thoughts on this here. So the starting point of designing an order flow system is the idea that order flow has value. You know that the order flow has value, but you kind of don't know how much, right? You don't know how much it has. So one of the first things that you need to try to figure out how to do is measure the value of the order flow. And the system itself should be able to do this. The second thing that the order flow system should be able to do is capture the value of the order flow. I mean, what's the point of an order flow system that just delivers all the value to the block builders and the searchers, right? Like really what you want from an order flow system is something that's able to capture some of that value and return it to either the order flow originator or the user that generated that value. And so the third problem is to attribute the value of the order flow. How much of that value should go back to the user? How much of it is attributable to the activity that the individual user took versus is sort of emergent out of the fact that like there's this aggregate order flow that exists? So I would posit that a good order flow system needs to be the best at all three of these things if it wants to win. And we can sort of look at, okay, well, how does the public transaction pool do on this? Well, it kind of like fails the first one. It kind of fails the second one, and it kind of fails the third one as well. So, you know, the public transaction pool is not a great order flow system from the perspective of the economics of it. But we're not stuck with the transaction pool forever. There are alternatives. So I'll deliver a few insights, I think, that are useful when we start to think about order flow systems, what are good order flow systems, and where it's likely to be going. The first one is that optimal price discovery is determined by open markets. So if I posit that the optimal order flow system is going to be the one that's the best at measuring the value of the order flow, and that the optimal price discovery mechanism is an open marketplace, then the conclusion is that any system, in order to win, will need to be decentralized and permissionless. Otherwise, it just won't be able to price the order flow accurately and most efficiently. An exclusive order flow market cannot compete with a completely decentralized and permissionless one. I think this is like the most important key takeaway here. In the next year, we're going to see so many different order flow systems be developed. Some of them that are more closed, more permission, using whitelist. Some of them that are going to be more open, more permissionless, with lower barriers to entry. And the permissionless ones are always going to outcompete the permission ones. All right, insight number 2. MEV is equivalent to gas price. Okay, this is kind of obvious when you think about it a lot, but on the surface, maybe it is not obvious. Because the corollary is that MEV minimization is actually equivalent to gas price minimization. So what do I mean by this? MEV can sort of be thought of as an implicit cost that the user is sort of incurring when submitting a transaction, right? When a user puts a trade on Uniswap and puts a high slippage, it could put a really high slippage and pay 0 gas price and still get the transaction included, right? Because it's paying someone else to do the conversion from slippage into gas price for the miner to then include it in the chain. So my claim is that means that these two are completely equivalent, right? I can set a trade with 0 slippage or even positive slippage and be completely out of the market, right? Like I could set a trade that is way overpriced
for what any market maker would be willing to pay. But if my gas price is high enough, someone will do the conversion of getting the transaction included on chain, receiving the gas price, then buying and fulfilling the trade at whatever price it was. So MEV and gas price are isomorphic. They are equivalent. And the problem of protecting users, of minimizing the MEV, is also one of minimizing gas price. I'm getting the hand up. What does that mean?
That was the question.
Okay. I'm going to get to the questions after. I'm going to deliver the insights first, and then we can do a round of questions and go back to them. Okay. Insight number 3. Users have a time price preference curve. So a user will sort of think about, okay, I'm exposing some amount of price with my, I have to incur some amount of cost to get my transaction included, right? And I think users have sort of been put into this mindset that if they increase the gas price that they're paying, they're going to get prioritized execution, and they're going to be included faster. So there's this trade-off here between the price and the time of execution that can actually be thought of also in the context of MEV. If I expose more MEV in my transaction, I'm able to get included faster, right? If my transaction has more slippage, I'm going to be able to get included faster. But this also is sort of a very rough metric for how to define this preference curve, right? Like when a user defines just a single gas price for a transaction, they're not defining their curve. They're defining a single point in the curve instead of a dynamic preference that changes depending on the state of the market. So what you would rather want is to have some kind of system that allows for the user to define a more granular curve of, okay, well, if I get it included in the next block, I want to pay this price. The block after that, I'll pay a little bit less or maybe a little bit more. You want the user to be able to define this curve. And yeah, in particular, users are willing to compromise on price optimality in order to get reliable execution. And really the reliable execution part of it, I think, is one that a lot of the non-transaction pool and somewhat permissioned order flow systems are missing on. It's very difficult to give reliable execution if you don't factor in this time price preference curve. All right, insight number 4, gas prices can be negative. This is kind of like, okay, well, how does it work, right? Like, we need to compensate the miners for including the transaction. But once you factor in MEV, right, really what miners are getting, they're getting an MEV, a hidden MEV value plus gas price. So if the MEV value is high enough, the gas price can be negative, and you can actually pay a user to get the transactions included. You don't need like complicated systems that like have outside bidding. You just need to have these new transaction type that are allowed to be negative. So what's the solution? Well, I kind of hinted at it at the beginning with the escalator. So there's this concept of the fee escalator. It was talked a lot about a little bit over a year ago around the London hard fork. And it's the idea that like users don't really know how to estimate the amount that they're willing to pay for the block space that they're consuming. And there's a benefit to introducing new transaction types to allow users to start with a very negative gas price. They don't know how much MEV they're exposing. They don't know what's the value of their transaction to the miner. So you start very negative, and then over time, you escalate the fee so that the user is willing to expose a little bit more MEV or spend a little bit more on gas fees. And gradually, at some point, some block builder, some searcher will be willing to take the other side of that, will be willing to take the transaction and include it in a block. The important part here is that it essentially transforms paying for gas price from a user perspective into a Dutch auction, right? Like you start at a very unattractive price and then you increase it until the price becomes attractive for the counterparty to take it. And you can do this at the transaction level for every single user transaction. It protects the user from MEV. It makes sure that they expose the least amount of MEV possible by tweaking this gas price value. And it also allows it to be completely permissionless. Because all of a sudden now you can introduce these transaction types to the public transaction pool and have sort of permissionless bidding on top of those transactions. Okay, that's it. Questions?
So your insight number 2 about how MEV is equivalent to gas price. This equivalent sounds like the old sort of auction modeling for gas prices. Since EIP 1559, I feel like this doesn't work, this statement.
It still does. So something that's interesting about 1559 and base fees is they sort of don't factor into any MEV calculation. They're like a sunk cost. They're like a tax that's imposed by token holders and of a network on using their currency for the network.
So when you say this, you don't refer to the base fee, but the tip.
Correct. Yeah. So the base fee is just like a tax that gets like added to all of this. So like the MEV plus gas price that's paid needs to be at least as high as the base fee plus some tip for the block space inclusion. The base fee is like just it's a tax for using the system that needs to get paid for somewhere, and it gets paid from the sum of these two.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So you made the statement that you believe that basically like we won't have private order flow. And my understanding is that most LPs in traditional markets, the reason that they bid order flow is because they want to basically avoid toxic flow, which is saying that basically if I have a better view of the price, then I can exploit that and make the spread. So do you think that by making this Dutch auction change that then whatever price that is, that's basically going to have to be, like all LPs will basically, they have to be profitable, right? So that they won't include in a block until, your Dutch auction has basically like reached that same equilibrium, if that makes sense. So is it actually better for the user, or are you just reaching the same point of stasis where everyone is, happy, but they're still compromising?
I'll restate your question because it's a great question. And I think you're on the right insight. So the question is kind of, if I can reframe it as, okay, well, this is all nice and well that you have this fee escalator, but is this really the optimal price discovery given that market makers are willing to bid for non-toxic flow, right? And if all the flow is sort of homogeneous and going through this public transaction pool, you're losing that information value. And so therefore, are they like not going to be willing to pay as much? And I think that is probably the case. So I don't think that the fee escalator is the full solution. I think that it requires still some mechanism to capture that value. And I would put this into the measuring the value of the order flow. So as soon as you publish transaction publicly, right, you're exposing information value. That actually the information value is very difficult to attribute, right? So when you think about toxic flow versus non-toxic flow, it's not really at the transaction level, right? Like I can auction off a single transaction and it'll be like, okay, well, this kind of seems like a regular trade. But then if I add the metadata that says like the source of origin, then I'll say, oh, well, this is definitely a bad trade. It's like coming from Wintermute or whatever, right? So so there's this like problem around having these like public markets for this that cause the issue. Though I think the fallacy that people will fall into is that public market is going to be equivalated with permissionless markets. So I think you can have permissionless markets that are decentralized but maintain the privacy, and that's probably going to be the optimal solution to these 3 points here.
I've heard this before, but what do you think kind of like the switch to proof of stake will do, like even like in the early days to MEV? Because I heard the main worry and like the merge breaking is actually in like crazy MEV and like a very high inefficiencies happening like next few weeks. Like what's your take on it? Like also playing out like over years or months, how it's changing.
Yeah, so the main change with the MEV landscape after the merge is this one, right? Is the separation of these two. I think over the next few weeks, it'll be crazy, and like validators will come to grips with what it means to be running nodes in a network that's live. And I don't think anyone's ready for the MEV that's going to take place. Probably the faster that validators adopt MEV-Boost, the better the network will be. But we'll sort of have, the merge also allows us to see something that we haven't seen, which is like, what does Ethereum with a lot of usage look like when you don't have an outsourcing market for block space? And so if the majority of validators don't adopt this like outsourcing marketplace, we'll see what games end up playing. Thankfully, there's like a marketplace that allows them to outsource it, and eventually it'll stabilize and things will be fine. The problems I'm talking about, with this are much longer term, sort of 6 months to a year plus problems, and the solutions that'll happen. I'm not really worried in the short to medium term.
I have a question. Thanks for the idea. I think it's a very nice, innovative solution or approach to redistributing and attributing MEV. I was just wondering on your take on how this differs from actually implementing Dutch auction mechanisms into the trading venues themselves. Like let's say Uniswap or whatever AMM you're using had this system where you're placing an order that's outside the market price, and over time your slippage tolerance grows and grows and grows until it's eventually fillable and would be filled at this point. How is addressing it on like the EAP or level 1 layer better than addressing this on the DApp layer?
So my theory on this is that this is generic enough to be useful for any type of transaction, and you can implement like a DEX use case or a swap use case on top of it while still using the same account abstraction layer. But it does probably require some level of account abstraction or some tooling to be able to like do it more effectively. The goal is to have some standard new transaction type that's generic enough to support like the broadest possible set of use cases, and then implement like specific use cases like swaps on top of it. Obviously, swaps is like the biggest use case for this.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And so I want to come back to what you said about defining, the user defining the gas price they're willing to pay depending on the market conditions. Mm-hmm. So defining a curve. How would you go about doing that? And also, how would that fit with the Dutch auction solutions? Because now you want to define a curve, and Dutch auction just define just one price. So how would that work?
I don't know if Dutch auction is the right term, but the way that I'm thinking about Dutch auction, it is this curve. It is this like price curve that's incrementing with time. This is a UX problem. I'm not a UX guy. This is like up to the wallets and the applications to figure out like how do you define curves? What are the different curves that are possible? How do you like get the user who doesn't know what the hell they're doing to like pick one curve? I don't know. This is the application layer, the wallets that are going to have to figure this out. I mean, I can give some ideas, right? Like you can have like a fast, medium, slow mode, right? Like we've seen with gas prices in the past, high protection, medium protection, low protection, or like, it's kind of like the same thing as defining slippage. There isn't like a perfect way to do it. At the end of the day, you need some system that's able to estimate the value of the trade, right? So one of the tools I think doesn't exist yet that will likely exist in the future is some simulation service where you can just send a transaction without having like a signature in it, and it just tries to estimate to you what's the MEV value of that transaction, and that helps you like define what is the starting point for this price curve. It's kind of similar to like an aggregator, right? Like a DEX aggregator where you like submit a trade request and it gives you like the best price. You kind of want the same thing, but just for any sort of MEV. And then you can use that in your UI, in your wallets to start to display like, okay, this is the starting point for this price curve. And that will be helpful.
I think that might be one. Yeah, we've got time for one more.
Cool, thanks. Basically, the question would be, so the model seems to assume that there's a fixed...
Put your hand up, I can't see.
Hi. Yeah.
Oh, all right, hey.
Sorry. Basically, the model, I think, seems to assume that there's a fixed or well-defined value of MEV of each transaction, but I think in some cases it might depend on the state and also on other transactions in the mempool at the same time. Does that change anything, or is that a problem or not?
It affects the optimality. So yeah, what we're getting into is like discrete time. Let's see. Yeah, it's probably this one still. So what you're alluding to, I think, is like, yeah, what are the discrete time steps in this preference curve relative to like the state of the blockchain, relative to like the state of other blockchains, of centralized exchanges, etc. And what if the prices or like the MEV, the state on these other chains, these other domains changes within a single price step on this curve, right? Like then obviously the user is not able to capture that. But if this price curve, the time steps are like granular enough and small enough, then it should mitigate for any sort of crazy movement on some other domains and like capture the minimum amount of it. So one of the assumptions that this makes is once a user makes it past a certain point in the curve, right, like it's slowly incrementing, it can never go back down, right? It can only be included or like try to cancel it or whatever, but it doesn't have the ability of like then adapting and then like resetting lower point and then going back up. It's a single price curve.
All right, one more round of applause.